Nehemiah chapter 4, 1-6. When Sanballat heard that we were rebuilding the wall, he became angry and was greatly incensed. He ridiculed the Jews, and in the presence of his associates and the army of Samaria, he said, "What are those feeble Jews doing? Will they restore their wall? Will they offer sacrifices? Will they finish in a day? Can they bring the stones back to life from those heaps of rubble, burned as they are?" Tobiah the Ammonite, who was at his side, said, "What they are building, even a fox climbing upon it would break down their wall of stones." But Nehemiah did not give up hope. Nehemiah said, "Hear us, O God, for we are despised. Turn their insults back on their heads. Give them over as plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or block out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults in the face of the builders." So we rebuilt the wall till all of it reached half its height, for the people worked with all their heart. Reverend Bice had asked me to share my thoughts on the verses. And here's what I'll say. When we set out to do something, we need to trust God to see us through to the end. And I just want to encourage us, and I'm talking from my own experiences. When we set out to do something, let us trust God. When the enemy comes to discourage and ridicule us and make us feel like we can't accomplish anything and that what we do will never be good enough, we need to pray and trust God. We may not have the wherewithal to do it, but we need to trust God and know that He will fight for us. The one thing He wants us to do is to put our whole heart in it. And this is exactly what the Jews did. They did it with all their heart. God gave them the will to do it with all their hearts. We need to do it wholeheartedly, and He will do the rest. The Jews did not have the best materials to work with, nor the strongest laborers. Remember, the enemy called them feeble. But they trusted God. Nehemiah knew that God would fight for them and that He would see them through. And while the enemy was mocking their work, Nehemiah counteracted the ridicule with prayer. And a lot of times we turn to all sorts of things and all sorts of people before we turn to God. But Nehemiah didn't think twice. He didn't even try to retaliate or do anything on his own because he knew he couldn't do it in his own strength. He knew his limitations. So he called upon his God. He knew he could trust God to see him and his team through. And all Nehemiah did was prayed. And remember, he prayed. He said, "Hear us, O our God, for we are despised." And he asked God to turn their insults back on their own heads. Give them over to plunder in a land of captivity. Do not cover up their guilt or blot out their sins from your sight, for they have thrown insults at the builders. And that may seem to you to be a little violent. And I know that sometimes we as Christians, when the enemy attacks, we don't want prayer, bad prayer, because we feel like as children of God, we should just keep it clean. But if we call ourselves soldiers of God's army, we have to be violent. Sometimes we have to be violent. Do you know of any soldier who doesn't have a streak of violence in him? When the enemy attacks, there's a violent streak that rises up in you. And if you don't use that streak, then the enemy will have the upper hand. There's a time for everything under the sun. And I believe there's a time to be violent. Not to go out there and commit bloodshed, but we have to be brave enough to pray violent prayers upon the enemy. Call down fire from heaven, the tempest of the Lord, the furnace of affliction, the fire and thunder of God, the horrible tempest. Violent prayers. Those are just a few. Nehemiah's was not that violent, but I just want to tell you that desperate times call for desperate measures. So we need to keep these weapons in our arsenal. God heard Nehemiah and He answered, but not in the way that you and I or even Nehemiah might have thought that he would. Rather than wipe out the enemy, God answered by preparing his people. He prepared them by encouraging them and by giving them the will to work. They continued the work with all their heart until it was half the way. So the first thing God will do when the enemy is plotting and mocking and strategizing is prepare us. He will give us the will to carry on no matter what, to pray and to trust him even in the face of fear and threats. God will give us the grace and the strength to carry on the work and to do so wholeheartedly, knowing that he has our backs. So I'm encouraging us to keep on keeping on, even in the face of adversity, knowing that God is with us and he will see us through.